Chapter 2, Literature Review. Rethinking Art Education to Enact Critical Consciousness. Rethinking art education should be considered in order to give middle school students more opportunities in the educational system for high levels of learning, divergent thinking, and self-efficacy to succeed academically despite the academic challenges put in place by the structures of education. As a result of using critical race theory and critical pedagogy as the framework of my study, students will become critically conscious of the education they receive when incorporating art education with creative learning principles. When using critical race theory as part of the framework, students will integrate lived experiences, cultural competence, and interdisciplinary knowledge as part of their art education that incorporates critical learning principles. However, Alice does not explicitly address critical race theory in her study. Alice does make connections of how learning through creative learning principles incorporates students' knowledge gained from personal academic lives to develop solutions to academic challenges through rhizomatic learning. Rhizomatic learning connects concepts acquired inside or outside the classroom and applies that knowledge to a problem from any subject matter to create a creative solution. An art education that uses creative learning principles that encourages students to ask questions, thought-provoking dialogue can potentially occur when students are critically conscious. Ferry believed that dialogue must be reciprocal between students and teachers for higher levels of cognitive learning to occur. The dialogue that Ferry mentions could potentially occur in an art education class that uses creative learning principles. The dialogue that Ferry mentions between teachers and students for learning to occur also exists in art education with creative learning principles as teachers work with students to evaluate and create their work. Even though Alice does not mention critical consciousness, students engage in the transformation of knowledge that occurs in critical consciousness that Ferry refers to, as students plan, design, create, reflect, and continue to improve their work. Students will be increasingly aware of the educational inequities between traditional art education classes and art education that includes creative learning principles as middle school students become more critically conscious. Students will use critical race theory to challenge the assumption that educational institutions create equitable opportunities. Critical race theory and critical pedagogy are a part of the framework of this study to make students conscious of the education they receive, to be empowered to enact change when students receive art education with creative learning principles. Critical consciousness is essential for students to develop to think critically of how art education with creative learning principles has the potential to empower students to cultivate creative self-efficacy and divergent thinking. Students can become more critically conscious of their communities and educational institution inequities as they are introduced to critical pedagogy and critical race theory. Students will have the potential to overcome academic challenges if students are critically conscious of the existing inequities and receive art education with creative learning principles that cultivate self-efficacy and divergent thinking. Divergent thinking and self-efficacy developed through the arts with creative learning principles could potentially prepare students to overcome the academic challenges in education and high-stakes testing. Several studies have showed how art can impact long-term student academic achievement in multiple disciplines. Baker gave examples of students being able to use multiple intelligences, which led to an improvement in cognitive development, self-efficacy, and academic achievement through the integration of an art program. Moorfield Lang explained how students in middle school were able to improve the self-efficacy, motivation to come to school, student collaboration, and academic performance in art and other disciplines as well. Many of the reasons why some students are less engaged in school can be traced back to the lack of self-efficacy caused as a result of the current hegemonic hidden curriculum that is designed to meet the needs of corporations. Instead of giving students opportunities to have diverse learning opportunities, students in middle schools have limited hegemonic learning opportunities. This limited hegemonic learning is based on the pre-written course standards that are believed to potentially prepare students for high-stakes testing. Students are expected to learn predetermined and pre-selected information in class in order to prepare students for a standardized test that is pre-written. Students in affluent communities have the resources available to them in order to successfully prepare for standardized tests. As a result of receiving high scores on standardized tests, students in affluent communities are able to receive funding for programs such as art, engineering, and technology, giving these students an inequitable academic advantage over students from low socio-economic communities. Inequitable art education as a social issue. Schools in more affluent communities are starting to integrate art into their curriculum because of the benefits that art proposes for student academic achievement, an increase in self-efficacy, and divergent thinking. The lack of art education resources in low-income communities has become a social issue since these communities do not have the same access to art as a resource. Access to an art education is denied to low-income communities because the communities were not able to perform high on high-stakes tests. Therefore, funding to these schools is denied. Scores on high-stakes testing is one of the key determinants of how schools are funded. Schools in lower-income communities receive fewer resources to prepare for high-stakes testing, which causes these communities to receive lower scores. Instead of allocating funding and resources to have programs such as art available in low-income communities, politicians are often lobbied and manipulated to distribute funding for private education, private corporations, and military spending. Corporate interests are seeking to capitalize not only through private management of schools, but also directly on the processes of teaching and learning. Teaching critical pedagogy through the arts. As a result of NCLB, equity and social issues arise with students' access to an art education. Students in more affluent communities have art classes built into their curriculum with a budget for supplies. In addition to this, students are more enthusiastic, have a background knowledge in art, and have an existing experience creating art through project-based learning. If art resources are distributed in lower economic communities, the amount of resources are not evenly distributed. For example, schools in lower socioeconomic communities have a smaller budget to spend on art materials, and students do not have the same access to equipment, equal access to computers, or an art program at all. There has recently been more research that looks at how the lack of an art education has impacted the development of students when students that do not have access to the same opportunities of more affluent communities and do not have NCLB or Common Core standards to meet. The lack of an art education needs to be viewed as a social issue. Students in low-income communities do not have equitable access to art resources, which inhibits critical consciousness to cultivate divergent thinking and self-efficacy for more opportunities in higher education and future careers. Some students in affluent communities are able to flourish and attain academic achievements. Although art education is available in low socioeconomic communities, some students are receiving art education for the first time in high school to fulfill a graduation requirement. Markovic and Roboport studied if using critical pedagogy in art would help to empower students from a lower socioeconomic class background to understand their identity. Markovic and Roboport studied 8 high school immigrant participants that came from an underprivileged social class background. Markovic and Roboport's research occurred over a year of school and included participant observations as well as interviews with 8 participants. The study showed that the participants initially rejected the implementation of critical pedagogy and viewed art and painting with oil on canvas as being characteristics of high culture. Markovic and Roboport concluded that ultimately critical pedagogy in art education is more effective in providing learners with an understanding of art concepts, developing their interpersonal thought processes, and increasing knowledge of their community and its needs. The issue that occurred in the Markovic and Roboport study was that some of the high school students were not interested in developing solutions to issues in their community because of the connotation that some of the students believed art to have. Implementing art education in middle schools becomes increasingly important since students in the Markovic and Roboport study already began to have a negative perspective of what art meant to them. Students in California are only required to take art for 1 year as part of a high school requirement. It is possible for the students in the study had a negative connotation towards art because students were receiving art later in their education. These students in the study were not exposed to art education earlier in their lives and also may not have received examples of how art can positively impact the critical consciousness of their communities. If students are only required to take art later in their education in high school, students will likely be more resilient to incorporating art. Also, if students are receiving art for the first time in high school, much of the class time is spent on learning the fundamentals of art, and students might have trouble making connections of how art can be used for critical pedagogy. Art education needs to be implemented at a lower grade level than high school so that students are already introduced to the fundamentals of art, and students are aware of the positive impact art can have in their communities when art education is combined with critical pedagogy. By incorporating art education and critical pedagogy in middle schools, students will be more equipped and more class time can be spent addressing issues of adversity while continually cultivating divergent thinking and self-efficacy. Obstacles to cultivating self-efficacy through the arts. Shapiro and Hassinger found that the perceptions that students had of themselves was important to the students' success. Student self-esteem was diminished when students did not perform well in math and reading assessments. Shapiro and Hassinger found that it was more beneficial to student success if students received a more well-rounded educational experience. Since art promotes divergent thinking, art goes against epistemological knowledge and ideology reproduction often found in education, whereas in other disciplines, an entire class is instructed to use the same few solutions for the same problem. Students in Common Core disciplines rarely get opportunities to explore divergent thinking. Students enrolled in art classes have demonstrated an increase in levels of self-efficacy in art. As a requirement of art, students make multiple renditions to attain a desired outcome. In order to achieve the desired outcome, students must take risks, experiment, and be persistent in order to innovate. In middle schools, art-based learning is being recognized for its importance in divergent thinking and self-efficacy. High-stakes testing and test-driven curriculum have limited the opportunities available to students to have art as part of their curriculum. As a result of not having art, students don't have the same opportunities for brain development. Years pass from when an infant is in the period of rapid learning to the time a student has the opportunity to explore creatively and continually develop self-efficacy and divergent thinking through art education. Almost immediately as a child enters school, educators teach to the test. Instead of cultivating or nurturing a student's drive for self-efficacy to experiment, be creative, or explore, a student's divergent thinking is inhibited and brain development is stagnated. That opportunity to continue to learn through self-efficacy by experimenting, failing, and revising may never come to fruition since middle schools are not required to have an art class available due to school funding. In high school, art is an optional career pathway for students to establish with their counselors, which would allow students to take art for more than 1 year as an elective. If students do not express their interest in art, students will not be enrolled in art classes by their counselors for more than 1 year to fulfill the minimum graduation requirement. If students do not receive grades that are high enough for general core classes, then students are automatically enrolled in intermediate math and English classes. Students are placed in intermediate math and English classes to scaffold students from their current level of content knowledge to the student's expected level of content knowledge. Extra effort is made to get students' knowledge back to the expected level of content knowledge so that students can be placed in standard core math and English classes for students to perform better on high-stakes tests. If students perform low in core classes or high-stakes tests, then these students will not receive the same opportunities to develop their self-efficacy and creative learning principles through art. Equitable opportunities to measure success and achievement. As students move through the school system, many students begin to lose motivation. The loss of motivation is partially due to how success is measured and the limited opportunities that students have to demonstrate their growth and learning. The most common opportunities that students have are reduced to reading, writing, math, and science. Imagination and creativity are not used to measure success. Students need these alternative opportunities to measure success due to the multiple intelligences that students possess. Art can be used to appeal of all of Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. Gardner proposes that individual thinking can become more complex and richer by posing different levels of sophisticated questions when discussing works of art. Individual thinking becomes more complex and richer when individuals hear or observe others at a higher stage of thinking. By implementing art education with creative learning principles, each of Gardner's multiple intelligences can be appealed to, while also using art as an alternative form to measure success and performance. In order for students to continue to stay motivated, students need opportunities to improve when failing or not comprehending a subject. Students need to receive feedback and additional opportunities to improve upon their work. Students should have multiple opportunities to improve upon their work instead of high-stakes testing or in-class assignments that implement a pass or fail structure. These multiple opportunities allow for students to maintain their level of self-efficacy and motivation necessary to demonstrate progress for success. Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And feel free to watch any of the other related videos.